The alarm bells rang across the Earth Defense Force headquarters as Captain Jake Morrison rushed into the command center. His boots clicked against the metal floor while officers moved quickly around glowing computer screens. The message they had been waiting for had finally arrived, and it was not good news. "Sir, we have confirmation," said Lieutenant Danny Wright, his face pale as he looked up from his communication station. "The Zorvak fleet is moving toward our outer colonies. Intelligence says they will reach human space in 6 months." Jake felt his stomach drop. For 3 years, Earth had been preparing for this moment. The Zorvak Empire had conquered 12 different alien species across the galaxy. Their massive ships and powerful weapons had crushed every enemy they faced. Now it was humanity's turn. To face the storm, how many ships? Jake asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. "Over 300 battlecruisers, sir. Each one twice the size of our largest vessel. They also have support ships and troop carriers." Danny's voice shook slightly. "Our entire fleet has only 80 ships." Jake closed his eyes for a moment. The numbers were terrible, but he had expected this. Earth's leaders had known from the beginning that they could not match the Zorvaks in raw power. They would need something else to survive. Across the galaxy, War Commander Thexva stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the stars move past the viewing window. His 4 arms moved gracefully as he studied the tactical displays showing human territory. The Zorvak leader was tall and covered in dark scales, with sharp yellow eyes that missed nothing. "The humans are preparing their defenses," reported Subcommander Krextel, his voice filled with amusement. "They believe their tiny ships can stop our empire." Thexva made a sound that was close to laughter. "Show me their communication intercepts." The main screen displayed captured human military messages. Thexva read through reports about Earth's defensive preparations, their weapon systems, and their battle plans. What caught his attention most were the strange references to something called psychological operations and information warfare. "What are these terms?" Thexva asked his intelligence officer. "We believe they refer to some form of mental manipulation." "War Commander, the humans seem to think they can win battles by confusing their enemies rather than destroying them." The entire bridge crew burst into laughter. Several officers made jokes about human cowardice and their inability to fight properly. Thexva shook his head in disgust. "Pathetic," he said. "They waste time on mind games while we bring real weapons. This conquest will be easier than we thought." Back on Earth, Colonel Lisa Hayes walked through the underground facility that housed the Psychological Operations Division. This was her command, a secret department that most of the military did not even know existed. The room was filled with computers, communication equipment, and analysts studying alien behavior patterns. "Good morning, Colonel," said Dr. Nina Foster, a tall woman with gray hair who specialized in alien psychology. "We have been working all night on the Zorva cultural analysis." Lisa nodded and moved to the main display table. "What have you learned?" "The Zorvaks have a rigid social structure based on military rank and personal achievement," Nina explained. "However, their society is filled with competition and mistrust. Officers constantly try to advance by making their rivals look bad." "Interesting," Lisa said, studying the charts and graphs. "Can we use this?" "Absolutely. Their communication intercepts show constant arguments between different commanders. They are suspicious of each other by nature. If we can increase that suspicion, we might be able to turn them against each other." Lisa smiled for the first time in days. "Show me everything you have." Meanwhile, communications expert Kate Sullivan was working at a different station analyzing Zorvak language patterns and communication methods. She had been studying their messages for months, learning how they spoke to each other and what kinds of information they valued. "Colonel Hayes," Kate called out, "I think I know how to make fake Zorvak messages that will look real to them." Lisa walked over to Kate's workstation. "Explain." "The Zorvaks use specific phrases when they talk about military secrets. They also have particular ways of addressing different ranks. If we can create false messages using their own patterns, they might believe the information came from their own people." Lisa felt excitement building in her chest. "How long do you need to prepare?" Give me 2 weeks and I can create messages that will fool their best intelligence officers. The days passed quickly as Earth's forces prepared for the coming invasion. Captain Jake Morrison worked with his fleet commanders to plan defensive strategies, but everyone knew their ships were no match for Zorvac technology. The real hope lay in the secret work being done by Lisa Hayes and her team. The Zorvacs continued their advance, destroying human outposts and research stations along the way. They broadcast messages to Earth, demanding immediate surrender and warning of the destruction that would come if humans refused to submit. But instead of fear, the Zorvac messages received unexpected responses from Earth's government. Human leaders seemed almost welcoming, thanking the Zorvacs for their helpful information and promising to take full advantage of the opportunities they provided. War Commander HFY was confused by these responses. He had expected terror and desperate pleas for mercy. Instead, the humans seemed to be treating his threats as some kind of gift. What are they planning? He asked his staff officers. Perhaps they are too primitive to understand the danger, suggested Sub-Commander Vexena. Some species become confused when faced with superior technology. HFY was not satisfied with this explanation. In his experience, even the most primitive species understood the threat of death. The human responses felt wrong somehow, but he could not identify the problem. As the weeks passed, strange things began to happen. The Zorvacs started intercepting human communications that seemed to contain classified information about their own empire. The messages discussed internal Zorvac politics, personal conflicts between commanders, and secret military plans that should have been impossible for humans to know. At first, the Zorvac intelligence officers assumed these were lucky guesses, or information obtained from captured prisoners. But the details were too accurate and too specific. Someone was leaking information to the humans, and that someone had to be high in the Zorvac command structure. Sub-Commander Krextel brought his concerns to War Commander HFY during a private meeting. Sir, I believe we have a traitor among us. The humans know too much about our plans. HFY's eyes narrowed. Do you have evidence? The intercepted communications mention your personal meeting with Fleet Admiral Zorthek last month. They also reference the resource allocation dispute between Vexena and myself. Only officers at our level would know these details. The war commander felt anger building in his chest. Betrayal was the worst crime in Zorvac society, and the punishment was death. But he also knew that false accusations could destroy military unity just as effectively as real treason. Begin a quiet investigation, HFY ordered. But be careful. I do not want panic spreading through the fleet. Unknown to the Zorvacs, their worst fears were about to become reality. But the traitor they were looking for did not exist among their own ranks. The real enemy was something far more dangerous. Human intelligence officers who understood how to turn alien minds against themselves. Colonel Lisa Hayes reviewed the daily reports from her team with growing satisfaction. The first phase of their psychological operation was working perfectly. The Zorvacs were beginning to doubt each other, and that doubt would soon grow into something much more destructive. The war for humanity's survival had begun, and the battlefield was not in space, but in the minds of their enemies. The first shots of the war came without warning. War Commander HFY watched from his flagship as Zorvac battlecruisers opened fire on the human outpost at Kepler Station. The energy beams cut through the small defensive platforms like hot knives through butter. Within minutes, the station was nothing but floating debris and emergency escape pods. Target destroyed, War Commander, reported the weapons officer. No human survivors detected. HFY nodded with satisfaction. This was how real warfare should be conducted. Direct, brutal, and decisive. The humans would learn that their strange talk about mind games meant nothing when facing superior firepower. Captain Jake Morrison received the news about Kepler Station while his fleet was still 3 days away from the battle zone. The communication officer handed him the report with shaking hands. Jake read it twice before the reality sank in. 20,000 people, he whispered, all dead. His second in command, Commander Pete Johnson, placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. Sir, we need to respond. The crews are waiting for orders. Jake looked around the bridge at the faces of his officers. They all knew what they were facing. The Zorvak fleet was like a massive predator, and humanity's ships were barely more than annoying insects in comparison. Send word to all ships. Jake said finally, we advance as planned. But remember, our job is not to win battles. Our job is to buy time for the real plan to work. The next engagement took place near the mining colony of New Geneva. Jake led his fleet in a direct assault against the Zorvak advance force. The human ships fought bravely, but the outcome was never in doubt. Zorvak weapons tore through human shields like they were made of paper. The battle lasted only 2 hours. When it was over, Jake had lost 12 ships and nearly 4,000 crew members. The Zorvaks had lost nothing except some energy from their weapon systems. Fall back to defensive positions, Jake ordered, his voice heavy with grief. We have done what we can here. As the surviving human ships retreated, something strange happened. The Zorvak fleet intercepted a human communication that should have been impossible to detect. The message was heavily encrypted and marked as top secret, but somehow it reached Zorvak intelligence systems. Commander Vexina was the first to read the intercepted message. His yellow eyes widened as he studied the contents. The communication appeared to be between two high-ranking human officers, and it contained detailed information about Zorvak fleet movements and command decisions, but more disturbing was what the message revealed about the Zorvak command structure itself. The humans seemed to know about the growing tension between different Zorvak commanders. They knew about the resource disputes, the personal rivalries, and the political maneuvering that was supposed to be secret. This is impossible, Vexena muttered to himself. How do they know about our internal affairs? The message also contained something even more shocking. It suggested that certain Zorvak officers were secretly communicating with human intelligence, providing information in exchange for promises of better treatment after the war. Vexena immediately took the message to War Commander Thexva. The two Zorvak officers studied the communication in private, their faces growing darker with each line they read. Someone is betraying us, Thexva said, his voice filled with cold anger. The humans could not know these details unless they had help from within our own ranks. But who? Vexana asked. The information covers multiple departments and command levels. It would have to be someone with access to our most classified materials. Meanwhile, deep in the underground facility on Earth, Colonel Lisa Hayes was monitoring the Zorvak reactions to their first planted message. Dr. Nina Foster sat beside her, watching the alien communications with growing excitement. They are taking the bait, Nina reported. Intercepted Zorvak messages show increased security measures and internal investigations. They are starting to suspect each other, Lisa smiled grimly. Good, Kate. How are the follow-up messages coming along? Communications. Expert Kate Sullivan looked up from her workstation. I have 3 more ready to transmit. Each one will appear to come from different sources within the Zorvak fleet. They will contradict each other in subtle ways. Perfect, Lisa said. The key is to make them question everything they think they know about their own people. Lieutenant Danny Wright, who had been monitoring human fleet communications, turned to face the group. Colonel, Captain Morrison is requesting permission to engage the Zorvak main fleet. He says his crews are ready for another fight. Lisa shook her head. Tell him negative. We need the Zorvaks to keep advancing. Every victory they achieve makes them more confident and less careful about their internal security. Back in space, the Zorvak fleet continued its devastating advance through human territory. They destroyed 3 more outposts and 2 small colonies, each victory easier than the last. The humans seemed unable to mount any effective resistance, but with each triumph, the Zorvak commanders found more disturbing intelligence reports. Human communications continued to reveal intimate knowledge of Zorvak politics and military planning. Worse yet, the intercepted messages began to name specific Zorvak officers as potential traitors. Commander Krextel was reviewing the latest intelligence when he discovered something that made his blood run cold. A human message specifically. mentioned him as a valuable asset, who had been providing excellent information about fleet movements and command decisions. The message went on to praise Krextel's cooperation and promised him a high position in the new colonial administration after the war ended. Krextel knew the message was false. He had never communicated with any human agents, and he was completely loyal to the Zorvek Empire. But he also knew that War Commander HFY would not believe his denials if this message reached the wrong people. At the same time, Sub-Commander Vexana was dealing with his own crisis. He had discovered a human communication that seemed to be a response to information he had supposedly provided. The message thanked him for detailed reports about HFY's tactical plans and promised to transfer the agreed payment to your secret account. Vexana had never seen this account and had certainly never provided any information to human forces. But the message contained accurate details about recent tactical decisions that only someone in his position would know. Both sub-commanders realized they were being framed, but they also began to suspect each other. If someone was feeding information to the humans, it had to be someone with high-level access. And each officer knew that his rival had both the opportunity and the ambition to betray the fleet. The paranoia began to spread through the Zorvak command structure like a virus. Officers started watching each other more carefully, looking for signs of treachery. Meetings became tense affairs where every word was analyzed for hidden meanings. War Commander HFY noticed the change in his staff, but he did not understand its source. His officers seemed distracted and suspicious, spending more time investigating each other than planning military operations. "What is wrong with everyone?" he demanded during a command staff meeting. "We are winning this war easily, yet you all act like we are facing defeat." Sub-Commander Krextel exchanged a meaningful look with Sub-Commander Vexana. Both officers were thinking the same thing. Their commander was either incredibly naive or he was the real traitor, trying to deflect suspicion from himself. The meeting ended with nothing accomplished except increased mistrust among the senior officers. As they left the conference room, Krextel quietly approached Vexana. "We need to talk," he whispered, privately. Vexana nodded, his own suspicions growing. "My quarters, 1 hour." Neither officer realized that their private conversation would soon become the subject of another intercepted human communication, one that would push the Zorvak fleet even closer to the edge of internal collapse. Captain Jake Morrison continued his fighting retreat, losing ships and crew members with each engagement. But he also continued to follow his orders, maintaining communication protocols that allowed Colonel Hayes and her team to plant their psychological weapons deep in the heart of the enemy fleet. The real battle for humanity's survival was not being fought with lasers and missiles. It was being fought with carefully crafted lies and the ancient human understanding that the mind can be a more powerful weapon than any technology. Sub-Commander Vexana waited in his quarters for exactly 1 hour before Krextel arrived. The two Zorvak officers had served together for 5 years, but now they looked at each other with barely hidden suspicion. The door sealed shut behind them, ensuring their conversation would remain private. "We have a problem," Krextel said without greeting. "The humans know too much about our operations. Someone is feeding them information." Vexana studied his colleague's face carefully. "I agree, but the question is who?" "The leaked intelligence covers multiple departments and command levels." "What if it is someone very high up?" Krextel suggested. "Someone with access to all our classified materials?" Both officers were thinking the same thing, but neither wanted to say it out loud. War Commander HFY had access to everything. He could easily be passing secrets to the humans while pretending to lead the invasion. "That would explain why he seemed so confident," Vexana said slowly. "Maybe he already knows the outcome of this war." Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent message from the communication center. Another human transmission had been intercepted, and this one was even more disturbing than the previous ones. The message appeared to be a progress report from a human intelligence officer to his superiors. It contained detailed information about the success of their asset placement program within the Zorvak fleet. The report mentioned several Zorvak officers by name, praising their cooperation and valuable contributions. But what made both sub-commanders freeze was a specific paragraph about their own meeting. The human message described their private conversation in Vexena's quarters, including direct quotes from their discussion about War Commander Thexva. "This is impossible," Vexena whispered. "We just finished talking. How could the humans know what we said?" Krextel looked around the room with growing paranoia. Unless one of us is the traitor and this whole meeting was a setup. Both officers reached for their weapons at the same time. The tension in the room became so thick it was almost visible. They stood facing each other, hands on their sidearms, each convinced that his former friend was now his greatest enemy. "You are the spy?" Krextel accused. "You arranged this meeting to get information from me." "No," Vexana replied, his voice shaking with anger. "You are the one working with the humans. You wanted to see how much I knew about your betrayal." The confrontation was interrupted by another urgent message. This time it was a direct order. From War Commander Thexva, summoning both officers to the bridge immediately. They walked through the corridors of the massive ship in silence, each watching the other for signs of treachery. When they reached the bridge, they found Thexva studying a tactical display with an expression of deep concern. "We have a serious problem," the War Commander announced. "Human resistance is becoming more organized. They seem to know our battle plans before we implement them." Krextel and Vexena exchanged meaningful looks. This was exactly what they had expected to hear from someone who was secretly working with the enemy. "Perhaps we should change our communication protocols," Vexena suggested carefully. "If the humans are intercepting our transmissions, we need better security." Thexva turned to face his subordinates. "I have already considered that. But changing our systems would require access to the central command codes. Only someone at the highest levels could authorize such changes." The implication was clear. Thexva was suggesting that the traitor was someone with command-level access, someone like Krextel or Vexena. Meanwhile, on Earth, Lieutenant Commander Rick Stone was working late in the Psychological Operations Center. He had been crafting the latest series of intercepted messages, and he was particularly proud of his recent work. The conversation between the two Zorvak sub-commanders had been recorded through careful monitoring of their ship's internal communication systems. "Colonel Hayes," Rick called out, "you need to see this. The Zorvaks are starting to turn on each other." Lisa Hayes walked over to Rick's workstation and studied the surveillance reports. The Zorvak fleet was showing signs of internal stress. Security measures had been increased, and several officers were now under investigation for suspected treason. "Excellent work," Lisa said. "How long until they reach the breaking point?" "Not much longer," Rick replied. "I have prepared 3 more message packages that should push them over the edge. Each one will appear to come from different sources, and they will all contradict each other in subtle ways." Dr. Nina Foster joined the conversation, carrying a thick folder of psychological analysis reports. The Zorvak personality profiles suggest they are extremely vulnerable to paranoia. Their military culture emphasizes loyalty above all else, which makes accusations of betrayal particularly devastating. "What about their war commander?" Lisa asked. "Is he starting to crack under the pressure?" Nina shook her head. "Not yet. He is more experienced and better at controlling his emotions. But if we can convince his subordinates that he is the traitor, they might take action against him." Communications expert Kate Sullivan looked up from her equipment. "I have something that might help." The Zorvaks use a specific code phrase when they communicate about classified military operations. If we can create a message that appears to show their commander using this phrase in communications with human agents, it will be very damaging. Lisa smiled grimly. "Do it. But make sure the message reaches the right people at the right time." Back on the Zorvak flagship, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense. Officers watched each other with suspicion, and normal military discipline was beginning to break down. Sub-Commander Krextel had begun conducting his own investigation into the suspected traitors. While Subcommander Vexena was doing the same. Their separate investigations led them to the same conclusion. Someone very high in the command structure was working with the humans. But they reached different conclusions about who that person might be. Krextel became convinced that Vexena was the traitor, especially after discovering that several leaked pieces of information had come from Vexena's department. He began gathering evidence to present to War Commander Vexva. At the same time, Vexena was building his own case against Krextel. He had noticed that many of the security breaches seemed to involve tactical information that would have been available to Krextel's staff. Neither officer realized that both sets of evidence had been carefully manufactured by human intelligence specialists who understood exactly how to exploit Zorvak psychology. The situation reached a critical point when both sub-commanders requested private meetings with War Commander Vexva on the same day. Each wanted to present evidence that his rival was the traitor. Vexva agreed to meet with both officers, but separately. He was becoming increasingly concerned about the breakdown in discipline among his senior staff. The first meeting was with Sub-Commander Krextel, who presented a detailed report about Vexena's suspected treachery. The evidence seemed convincing, including communication logs that showed Vexena had been in contact with suspected human agents. "This is very serious," Vexva said after reviewing the material. "If these accusations are true, we must act immediately." An hour later, Vexena presented his own evidence against Krextel. His report was equally detailed and equally convincing. It showed clear patterns of information leakage that could only have come from someone in Krextel's position. Vexva studied both reports in private, trying to determine which of his subordinates was telling the truth. The evidence against each officer was strong, but it was also contradictory. Both men could not be traitors, yet both sets of evidence seemed authentic. For the first time since the invasion began, War Commander Vexva began to question his own judgment. If he could not trust his most senior officers, how could he trust anyone? And if both of his sub-commanders were working together to deceive him, what did that say about his leadership? The psychological pressure was beginning to affect even the most experienced Zorvak commander. The seeds of doubt that had been planted by human intelligence were now growing into something much more dangerous. Captain Jake Morrison continued his fighting retreat through human space, losing more ships and crew members with each engagement. But he also continued to follow his orders, maintaining the communication protocols that allowed the psychological operations to continue. The real war was not being fought in space between ships and weapons. It was being fought in the minds of the enemy commanders, and humanity was finally beginning to win. The Zorvak fleet moved through space like a wounded beast, still dangerous but bleeding from internal wounds. War Commander Vexva had spent 3 sleepless nights studying the evidence against his 2 sub-commanders, and the stress was beginning to show on his scaled face. The bridge crew worked in tense silence, aware that something was wrong with their leadership but not understanding what it was. Officers whispered to each other in corners, spreading rumors and suspicions that grew more wild with each telling. "War Commander," the communication officer called out nervously, "we have another intercepted human transmission. This one is marked as extremely urgent." Vexva took the datapad with tired hands and began reading. His yellow eyes widened as he processed the information. This message was different from the others. It appeared to be a direct communication from a human intelligence officer to his superiors, reporting on the success of their operation. The message contained a detailed progress report about the psychological destabilization program being conducted against the Zorvak fleet. It mentioned specific Zorvak officers by name, describing how they were being manipulated and turned against each other. But what made Vexva's blood run cold was the final paragraph. The human message described him as the primary target and stated that the war commander will soon receive evidence that will force him to take action against his own officers, completing the destruction of their command structure. Vexva realized with growing horror that he had been played. The evidence against Krextel and Vexon might be fake, planted by human intelligence to make him destroy his own command staff. But it was also possible that this new message was fake, designed to make him trust officers who were actually traitors. The war commander felt trapped in a web of lies and deception, unable to determine what was real and what was manipulation. For the first time in his military career, he was paralyzed by doubt on Earth. Colonel Lisa Hayes was monitoring the psychological pressure being applied to the Zorvak fleet. The stress levels among their command staff were approaching critical levels, and she knew it was time for the final phase of the operation. "Amy," she called to communications specialist Amy Chun, "initiate the endgame protocol. I want War Commander Thexva to receive the package within the hour." Amy nodded and began preparing the most sophisticated piece of psychological warfare ever created by human intelligence. This message would appear to be a secret communication from Thexva's most trusted aide, offering to betray the invasion in exchange for protection and rewards from the human government. The message was crafted to look authentic in every detail. It used proper Zorvak military terminology, referenced specific events that only someone close to Thexva would know, and contained personal information about the war commander's family and background. "The message is ready," Amy reported. "It will appear to originate from Senior Aide Zekvar's personal communication device." Lisa studied the final message one more time. It was perfect in every way except for one crucial detail. It was completely false. Senior Aide Zekvar was completely loyal to the Zorvak Empire and had never communicated with human forces. "Send it," Lisa ordered. "And make sure it reaches Thexva's personal communication system." Back on the Zorvak flagship, Senior Aide Zekvar was working late in his office when he received an urgent summons from War Commander Thexva. The young officer had served the war commander faithfully for 3 years, and he had never seen his commander look so angry. "Explain this," Thexva demanded, throwing a datapad across his desk. Zekvar picked up the device and began reading. His face went pale as he processed the contents. The message appeared to be from his own communication account, offering to provide classified information to human intelligence in exchange for money and protection. "Sir, I did not send this message," Zekvar said, his voice shaking with fear. "I have never communicated with any human agents. This is not real." Thexva studied his aide's face carefully. The young officer seemed genuinely shocked and confused. But then again, anyone who had been working with the enemy for months would be a skilled liar. "The message contains information that only you would know," Thexva said coldly. "Details about my personal schedule, my family background, my private concerns about the invasion. How do you explain that?" Zekvar realized that he was in terrible danger. Someone had used his communication account to send a false message, and now his life depended on convincing his commander that he was innocent. "War Commander, please," he begged. "I am loyal to the Empire. I would never betray you or our people. Someone is trying to frame me?" But Thexva was no longer listening. The stress of the past weeks had finally broken his ability to think clearly. He had been betrayed by someone, and all the evidence pointed to the young officer standing before him. "Guards," Thexva called out. "Arrest this traitor." 2 security officers entered the room and placed restraints on Zekvar's arms. The young aide continued to protest his innocence, but his words fell on deaf ears. "Take him to the detention center," Thexva ordered. "He will be executed for treason when we reach Earth." As Zekvar was dragged away, other officers on the bridge began to realize what was happening. Their war commander had just arrested his most trusted aide for treason. If Zekvar could be a traitor, then anyone could be. The paranoia that had been building for weeks suddenly exploded into open fear. Officers began watching each other with open suspicion, wondering who would be arrested next. Normal military discipline started to break down as everyone became more concerned with protecting themselves than following orders. Subcommander Krextel watched the arrest with growing concern. He had been preparing to present his evidence against Vexina, but now he wondered if he should wait. If Thexva was arresting loyal officers based on false evidence, then perhaps the war commander himself was the real traitor. At the same time, Subcommander Vexina was reaching the same conclusion. The arrest of Zekvar seemed like the desperate act of someone trying to eliminate witnesses to his own crimes. Maybe Dexva was working with the humans and was now covering his tracks. The two sub-commanders met secretly in a storage compartment deep within the ship. Both officers were armed and alert, still not trusting each other completely but united in their suspicion of their commanding officer. "This has gone too far," Krextel said quietly. "Zekvar is innocent. I have known him for years. He would never betray the Empire." Vexana nodded grimly. "Which means someone else arranged for that message to be sent from his account. Someone with access to command-level systems." "Vexva," they said at the same time. The realization hit both officers like a physical blow. Their war commander, the leader they had followed across the galaxy, was secretly working with the human enemy. He had been feeding information to human intelligence while pretending to lead the invasion. "We have to do something," Vexana said. "We cannot let him destroy the entire fleet." Krextel was already thinking about the practical aspects of their situation. "If we accuse him directly, he will have us arrested for treason. We need proof that even the other officers cannot ignore." "Or we need to act before he can respond," Vexana suggested darkly. Both officers understood what that meant. They were talking about mutiny, the most serious crime in Zorvik military law. But they were also talking about saving their fleet and their empire from a traitor who had already caused terrible damage. "The other ship commanders need to know," Krextel decided. "If we can convince them that Dexva is the traitor, they will support us." Vexana was already planning their next moves. "We need to act quickly. If Dexva realizes we suspect him, he will try to eliminate us before we can expose him." The meeting ended with both officers agreeing to contact other ship commanders and build support for their plan. Neither of them realized that their entire conversation had been monitored by human intelligence, and that their actions were exactly what the psychological operations team had been hoping for. Captain Jake Morrison continued his fighting retreat, now only 2 days away from Earth's solar system. His remaining ships were battered and barely functional, but they had accomplished their mission. The Zorvak fleet was tearing itself apart from within, and the final collapse was about to begin. The greatest military victory in human history was about to be achieved not through superior weapons or tactics, but through the simple understanding that minds could be more fragile than ships. The rebellion began at exactly 0800 hours ship time. Sub-Commander Krextel and Sub-Commander Vexana had spent the entire night contacting other ship commanders, convincing them that War Commander Dexva was a traitor working with the humans. The evidence they presented was overwhelming. The arrest of innocent senior aide Zekvar, the suspicious timing of intelligence leaks, and the War Commander's strange behavior all pointed to the same conclusion. Dexva had betrayed the Zorvak Empire. "All loyal officers must act now," Krextel broadcast to the fleet. "Our war commander has been compromised by human agents. We cannot allow him to continue leading us into a trap." The response was immediate and devastating. Half the fleet declared their support for the rebellion, while the other half remained loyal to Dexva. Within minutes, Zorvak ships were turning their weapons on each other instead of preparing for the final assault on Earth. War Commander Dexva watched in horror from his flagship bridge as his own fleet began to tear itself apart. Energy beams flashed between the massive warships as former allies became deadly enemies. "This is madness," he whispered, staring at the tactical display. "They are destroying everything we have worked for." His remaining loyal officers looked to him for orders, but Dexva seemed paralyzed by the nightmare unfolding around him. The great Zorvak fleet, which had conquered dozens of worlds, was committing suicide in the darkness of space. "Sir," his weapons officer called out desperately, "the cruiser Vector is targeting our engines." "Should we return fire?" Dexva closed his eyes for a moment. He finally understood what had happened to his fleet, but the knowledge came too late. The humans had not defeated them with superior weapons or brilliant tactics. They had simply turned the Zorvaks against themselves. "Yes," he said quietly. "Defend the ship. But remember, those are our own people we are fighting." The battle raged for 3 hours. Massive Zorvak warships, each one powerful enough to destroy a planet, blasted each other into floating wreckage. The space around Earth filled with debris and the bodies of alien warriors who had killed each other instead of their intended enemy, Sub-Commander Vexena, died when his ship was hit by a direct energy blast from one of the HFY's loyal cruisers. Sub-Commander Krextel survived the battle, but found himself commanding only a handful of damaged vessels when the fighting finally ended. More than two-thirds of the Zorvak fleet had been destroyed. The survivors were scattered, demoralized, and completely unable to continue their invasion of Earth. Captain Jake Morrison arrived at the battle site with his small fleet, just as the last shots were being fired. He stared in amazement at the field of alien wreckage floating in space. "My God," he whispered. "They destroyed themselves." His communication officer looked up from his station with wonder in his eyes. "Sir, we are receiving surrender requests from multiple Zorvak vessels. They want to discuss terms." Jake felt a mix of relief and sadness. Humanity had won, but victory felt hollow somehow. Thousands of alien warriors had died not in glorious battle, but in a civil war created by human manipulation. "Accept their surrender," he ordered. "And send word to Earth. The invasion is over." On Earth, Colonel Lisa Hayes received the news in the underground facility where she had planned humanity's greatest victory. Her team of psychological warfare specialists gathered around her, their faces showing exhaustion and quiet satisfaction. "We did it," Dr. Nina Foster said softly. "We actually did it." Lisa nodded, but she did not feel like celebrating. The Zorvak fleet had been destroyed, but it had been destroyed by human lies and manipulation. She wondered if that made humanity better than their enemies or worse. "The survivors want to meet with our leadership," Communications Specialist Kate Sullivan reported. "They want to understand what happened to them." "Set up the meeting," Lisa decided. "They deserve to know the truth." 3 days later, the remaining Zorvak commanders were brought to Earth under guard. War Commander Thexva, his scales now dull, with defeat and shame, sat across from Colonel Hayes in a secure conference room. "You destroyed us without firing a shot," he said, his voice filled with bitter understanding. "You turned our own nature against us." Lisa studied the alien commander's face. "Your fleet was destroyed by suspicion and paranoia. We simply provided the fuel for fires that were already burning." "But how?" Thexva demanded. "How did you know?" "Exactly how to manipulate us." Dr. Nina Foster leaned forward. "We studied your culture, your psychology, your communication patterns. We learned that your society was built on competition and mistrust. All we had to do was increase those natural tendencies." The messages, Thexva realized. All those intercepted communications, they were fake. "Every single one," Lisa confirmed. "We created them to make you suspect each other. We knew that once you started doubting your own people, you would do our work for us." Communications expert Kate Sullivan activated a display screen. "We analyzed your language patterns, your military protocols, even your personal relationships. Every fake message was designed to exploit specific weaknesses in your command structure." Thexva sat in silence for a long moment, processing the magnitude of his defeat. "Your species fights with minds instead of weapons." "When necessary," Lisa replied. "We prefer to avoid fighting altogether, but when forced to defend ourselves, we use every advantage we can find, including turning enemies against themselves," Thexva said with something that might have been respect. Lieutenant Commander Rick Stone, who had crafted many of the false messages, spoke for the first time. "Your own military culture made you vulnerable. The emphasis on personal advancement, the constant competition between officers, the paranoia about betrayal. We did not create those problems, we just made them worse." "What happens now?" Thexva asked. "Will you execute us for war crimes?" Lisa shook her head. "Humanity is not interested in revenge. We want to build a future where this kind of conflict is unnecessary." The negotiations that followed lasted for weeks. The surviving Zorvak commanders agreed to return to their empire with a message about humanity's capabilities. They would tell their leaders that humans were not the weak, primitive species they had appeared to be. "They fight with weapons we did not even know existed," Thexva would report to the Zorvak High Command. They can turn an army against itself without firing a single shot. They understand minds better than we understand technology. The Zorvak Empire, faced with the complete destruction of their most powerful fleet, agreed to a peace treaty. They promised to avoid human space and to spread word throughout the galaxy that humanity was not to be underestimated. Captain Jake Morrison was promoted and given command of Earth's expanding defensive fleet. But he often thought about the battle. That had never really happened. And the enemy that had been defeated by their own fears. Colonel Lisa Hayes continued to lead the Psychological Operations Division, but she also began working on diplomatic programs designed to prevent future conflicts. She had proven that minds could be more powerful than weapons, and now she wanted to use that knowledge to build peace instead of war. Dr. Nina Foster published detailed studies of alien psychology that became required reading at military academies throughout human space. Her work showed that understanding your enemy was more valuable than outgunning them. The story of humanity's victory over the Zorvak fleet spread throughout the galaxy. Other alien species learned that humans possessed a strange and terrible ability to fight battles without weapons, to win wars without violence, and to defeat enemies by turning them against themselves. And in the vast darkness of space, where countless civilizations watched and waited, a new understanding began to grow. Humanity had introduced a new kind of warfare to the galaxy, one that attacked minds instead of ships and conquered through psychology. Instead of firepower, the species that had once been dismissed as primitive and weak had proven that the greatest weapons were not always the most obvious ones. They had shown that sometimes the most devastating attack was simply helping your enemies destroy themselves.